Who is Kaiser Sose? I mean, who is Satoshi Nakamoto? Benjamin Wallace is here. He's just written a book. I devoured it. I was really intrigued. It's called The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto, a 15-year quest to unmask the secret genius behind crypto. Benjamin Wallace, welcome back. Nice to see you.
Michael, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Man, you didn't just fall down a rabbit hole. You wrote a rabbit hole. I mean, you take us through a 15-year quest to try and determine who is the guy who came up with this form of cryptocurrency. And it all begins for you because what? You were assigned that piece for Wired the very first time that Wired would cover Bitcoin?
Correct. Their first feature article in 2011, they assigned me to write it about Bitcoin. At the time, Silk Road was making the news, which was this dark web black marketplace, and the coin of the realm there was Bitcoin. And so that's what put it on journalists' radars.
Got to say, I was pretty impressed with you as a self-described liberal arts major to wade into these very complex waters. And at least as I understand from reading the book, you really seem to have a handle on it. I do not.
Well, I did not when I began. And when I first wrote about it in 2011, I felt sort of at a disadvantage because when you start delving into this mystery, you're really entering the technical weeds. And so as the mystery persisted over the ensuing, 15 years, 14 years, and journalist after journalist kind of fell into this tar pit of failed attempts to unmask Satoshi Nakamoto. When I returned to it full time in late 2021, I realized that I really needed to become conversationally fluent in the vernacular of this world. And so that's when I, sort of learned to code and really dove deeper.
So very superficially described, this is all about a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. I, by the way, am with your father-in-law. I like this description. Quote, "Why is Bitcoin worth anything?" my father-in-law asked one day. "Why is gold worth anything?" I said. My father-in-law looked at me impatiently. Why does everyone I ask this question respond with another question? Okay, funny exchange, but doesn't he have a point?
I stand by my point. I mean, Bitcoin, like gold and really any money pretty much is worth something because we have decided it's worth something. Enough people have agreed that it's worth something, and that's what gives it value.
So the origin of Bitcoin is a 9-page white paper. Explain.
Okay, so on Halloween of 2008, someone no one's ever heard of named Satoshi Nakamoto posts this 9-page document, sort of a almost academic type of paper, on this obscure email group of cryptographers. And this paper sketches out his idea for Bitcoin, right? This electronic money. And at the time, people had tried to make electronic money before. It seemed sort of inevitable once the internet, became as pervasive that, of course, money also should be digitized. And there was a problem at the time, though, called the double spending problem, which is basically if the internet is a Xerox machine, if it's just like anything can be instantly copied everywhere, like what was going to stop people from being able to respend the same money if you tried to create digital cash? So Satoshi Nakamoto's innovation using arcane computer science we're not going to get into was to solve the double spending problem and come up with a way to create this digital money for the first time that did not depend on a bank or government to authenticate it, to issue it, to control its supply. And instead of the database being controlled by a bank or a government of debits and credits, like who has this much in their account, who just transferred that much into this other person's account, a crowd would manage the database. And that crowd is the peer-to-peer network of volunteer computers, people who just added their computer to the network.
And Benjamin, the presumption of most, including yourself, is that Satoshi Nakamoto is a pseudonym. Although, interestingly, like in the book, you describe the 15-year quest to try and figure out who is this person. And in at least one instance, there is someone whose birth name was Satoshi Nakamoto. And for a while, you entertained the idea that this could be the person. Why do you think it's a pseudonym?
Well, the Bitcoin required a number of pretty sophisticated expertises in the person who invented it, ranging from, programming ability to an understanding of monetary theory and economics and game theory and cryptography. And so the idea that someone who no one in any of these specialized worlds would have heard of him sort of was unlikely in the first place. The other thing is that everything Satoshi Nakamoto did, and if you Googled Satoshi Nakamoto at the time, I mean, you would get like 0 hits. I mean, there was no other. Nowadays, it would be impossible to figure that out because the name's all over the place because of Bitcoin. But there just didn't seem to be a real Satoshi Nakamoto. And even the guy you referred to, who at one point Newsweek, ran a big cover story identifying a Satoshi Nakamoto, even with him, Satoshi was one of his 2 middle names. His name was Dorian Prentice Satoshi Nakamoto. But also the guy who invented Bitcoin and went by this name Satoshi Nakamoto, in many other ways, took clear steps to be hidden and unfindable and unknowable. And so it just seemed on its face to be very unlikely that it was his real name.
Do you believe that Satoshi Nakamoto is one person as compared to a group of people?
Well, if Satoshi Nakamoto, I'm going to answer this in a couple ways. If Satoshi Nakamoto was not invented by an intelligence agency, then probably it's one person, because I really find it difficult to believe that more than one person could keep this secret. Whereas in an intelligence agency, obviously every day groups hold secrets that are never revealed until they perhaps are ultimately declassified. The one exception outside of that scenario would be if, let's say, it was 2 people and one of them has died, and so it now is only one person holding the secret, or it was also, of course, it could be one person who died and no one has the secret.
By the way, there's a funny discussion in the book about Watergate and Mark Felt, and funny because you make the point in talking about exactly this issue. Like, if it were more than one person, don't you think people would know because you can't keep a secret? And then you go on to say in the book that actually a number of people were in the loop on Mark Felt, including from day one. And what stands out in my mind, I obviously have my highly annotated version of the book in front of me, but I don't have that tabbed. It was somebody who went to summer camp with one of Bob Woodward's kids, and they were actually in the loop? Or Bernstein?
Carl Bernstein's son, Jacob, who's now a New York Times reporter, at summer camp, he apparently told somebody that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, and then a friend of his from that summer camp told this to the Hartford Courant.
When was Satoshi Nakamoto last heard from, and what reason do you have to believe that Satoshi Nakamoto, assuming it is one person and it's a pseudonym, is alive?
So Satoshi Nakamoto, appears at Halloween of 2008 for the first time, this pseudonym, launches the software January of 2009, and then for the next 2+ years works with a open source community of programmers to nurture this software and the network. His last known communications with that community were some private emails in April of 2011. There is then one more communication that most people think was him in 2014 from one of the 3 email accounts he had used. I mean, there are some people who think, oh, maybe the email was hacked, but most people believe this was him. And that was on the occasion of Newsweek's cover story naming the other guy with the middle name Satoshi as the creator of Bitcoin, because that guy was just this, poor guy who was so broke he'd turned off his internet. He lived with his mom. He was an out-of-work engineer who happened to have this name. Once Newsweek named him, he got mobbed by, the media was encamped on his front lawn. There was a low-speed white Bronco-style chase on the freeways of Los Angeles when he was just, trying to drive away from his house, and all these reporters are following him and live tweeting like hashtag Bitcoin chase. And so at that point, a single communication appeared on one of the forums where Satoshi Nakamoto had been from one of his accounts, and it just said, "I am not Dorian Nakamoto."
Benjamin Wallace is the author of the new book, The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto, a 15-year quest to unmask the secret genius behind crypto. A big part of this story, there's an unrealized fortune, right, for Satoshi Nakamoto, and can Satoshi Nakamoto lay claim to that without revealing himself or herself? I guess, by the way, I should ask you that question. Why, gender-wise, do you think it's a male? Answer both of them.
Sure. So I use he and him because Satoshi Nakamoto is a male name, but it's certainly possible it could be a woman, it could be a group, right? So it's sort of just a linguistic convenience to say he. Having said that, sort of experts in stylometry who have analyzed his prose do think it tends to be male prose, and that's something that stylometry is pretty good at figuring out. So to the point of his wealth, and this also gets to your question about, is he alive or not? One of the most notable features of the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto is that he has 1.1 million bitcoins, which would be worth, I think, close to $100 billion today, put him in the 20 richest people in the world. And those coins have not been touched. And the way we know that they're his coins is because of a clever computer scientist who did sort of granular analysis of sort of early mining of the blockchain, and there was a way to see that there was a consistent signature to this mining, and it was the very earliest blocks. So you have to ask yourself, if Satoshi Nakamoto is just a civilian individual, how could they possibly not touch that money, right? Which points to it either not being a single civilian individual, or to them perhaps being not alive, or a third possibility, which is a realistic possibility, is they could have lost their keys to the coins, which is the equivalent of a sort of a cryptographic password.
Or an additional possibility is that it's someone like, or maybe is, Elon Musk, and that $100 billion could be chump change for that individual.
I agree. That is another possibility. I don't think it's Elon Musk, but it could be someone. I mean, another person who's been put forward as a possible Satoshi is Jack Dorsey, who would also fit in that category of rich enough to not touch the fortune.
Why is the world of cryptocurrency such the domain of libertarians?
Because baked into its very design is that, right, it was going to be free of governments and banks. And when it was launched, in the very first block in the blockchain, which is the name of this public database run by the crowd of computers, there was embedded a headline from the Times of London that read, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." So this was in the midst of the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, and clearly was a reaction against banks. A lot of the ideas that came together in Bitcoin came out of the kind of techno libertarian scene, and it's just inherently appealing to libertarians because it is free of governments.
You made reference to the human stylome, and I wondered as I read the book, and you address this in the book, but for the benefit of those who've not yet read it, why can't AI solve this? I'm using AI broadly. Why can't some forensic analysis using the best of computer skills determine, based on the writing pattern of the white paper, who is this guy?
Well, I tried to do that, and not using my own limited expertise, but by partnering with experts in prose stylometry, in code stylometry, people who can sort of do authorship attribution on these things. But you can only, work with the lineup you have, right? It's like a police lineup. If the purse snatcher's not there, then you're not going to identify the purse snatcher. And so one possibility, and this is one of the reasons I do not rule out an intelligence agency, is that Satoshi Nakamoto does not have a significant internet footprint, because I did have these experts do the analysis you're talking about on large sets of potential candidates. But I do, to your point about AI more literally, I don't rule out that a more advanced AI a few years down the road will be able to solve this.
But Benjamin, maybe he's Ted Kaczynski. I don't mean literally, but maybe he's a guy living in a cabin and has no footprint by design, and consequently your stylome analysis is never going to pick him up unless the sister-in-law outs him.
Absolutely. I talk about Ted Kaczynski a bit in the book. I do think that the Kaczynski theory is a plausible one. I will say that the design of Bitcoin did seem to indicate someone who had been a working programmer, though, and was not an isolate. It had a sort of worldliness about it, and seemed to be a very experienced person who had experience also working with teams.
So I've got this vision of your workspace being like something you see on TV in a detective lab where they're putting up all the Post-it notes and so on, and a map and pictures and trying to identify. But don't get nervous. I'm not going to give away all the book for free, but I just want to get to this part. The Satoshi checklist. So you say, above the spreadsheet, I taped a checklist, a column of criteria any plausible Nakamoto candidate would need to meet. Software tools, coding quirks, age, geography, schedule, use of English, nationality, prose style, politics, life circumstances, resume, emotional range, motivation, rationale, and, I love this, monkish capacity to renounce a fortune. Like that's what you're looking for. True?
Yeah, exactly. And anytime I had a candidate I was looking at, I would compare them with the checklist. And one of those that you mentioned, which might sound like a strange thing, the emotional range, I put in there specifically because at one point in my search, I became really convinced that I had found Satoshi Nakamoto. And ultimately, what made me turn away from that person is because Satoshi Nakamoto in all of his communications seemed like basically a normal person with a normal emotional range. Like he could be enthusiastic, he could be sympathetic, and he used exclamation marks. There was and this other guy who I became fixated on for a while was completely flat and incapable of any of those emotions.
In the end, if Occam's razor applies, the obvious answer, go with it. Don't confuse yourself by looking in other directions. Then what would that mean? What's the Occam's razor answer to this conundrum?
That's a tough one.
Because is it Dr. Craig Wright?
It is certainly not Dr. Craig Wright, the Australian computer scientist who has been claiming since 2015 that he is Satoshi Nakamoto, and who a British court recently compelled to post on his website, Craig Wright is not Satoshi Nakamoto. He is finally, a remarkable con man who, managed to raise a lot of money from some wealthy people to back his claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto. But it is not him. And I think the Occam's razor possibility is the writing is all in a consistent voice, and I believe is one person. But I don't think that rules out one person in concert with others who perhaps conceptualized it or, helped with the coding, et cetera. There is one person who's sort of the favored candidate. His name's Hal Finney. He's no longer with us. He was, very well positioned to do this. He was the second person known to have put his computer into the Bitcoin network. He had previously come up with a Bitcoin-like digital cash. He is one possibility. The other sort of rule of thumb I use, though, is that Sherlock Holmes adage, if the most obvious solutions are not true, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And that's why I just don't rule out intelligence agencies, because it would explain, someone without an internet footprint, why there's nobody who's a sort of precise hit with these stylometric tools.
But Benjamin,
why the money hasn't been touched.
What would be the motivation of an intel agency to want to set up an alternative form of currency?
Sure. Well, now I'm going to argue against myself, but because I don't find these very convincing, but the two arguments that have been made are one, as a honeypot, right? Like the FBI created its own encrypted cell phone network to attract organized crime, which then adopted these encrypted cell phones. And the FBI was listening in the whole time and ultimately busted like 800 people. So there's the honeypot theory. The other theory is they were creating a borderless, kind of relatively untraceable, off-the-grid payment infrastructure that they could use to get money to assets in closed countries.
And by accident ended up creating something that for some has become all the rage.
Exactly. That's that theory.
I'm just gonna leave this as a tease for people who've not yet read your book. But when you mention Hal Finney, it takes me into the world of cryogenics, and what cryogenics might have to do with cryptocurrency is just kind of wacky, interesting stuff. Hey, I'm about to do something when you leave me, and that is I'm going to read aloud from your book what Peter Thiel said and quoted the enemies list, because I'll be curious to know of my radio audience how many have sort of crossed the Rubicon and are investors and believers in this. Do you want to say anything about the enemies list before I do?
Well, only that, you know, the Bitcoin has developed a sort of zealous inner community that are known as Bitcoin maximalists or Bitcoin maxis, and they really do kind of see the world as us against them. And they imagine that sort of Bitcoin holders, these are the hardcore libertarians who, you know, talk about sort of surviving the societal collapse when no one else does. And everyone who ever talks out about Bitcoin or expresses skepticism about it joins this enemies list.
Right. And you say that, you know, the field, the people that you write about over the span of 15 years skew toward the paranoid and the autistic.
Well, it's certainly in the early years when to be, you know, interested in this currency was a very fringe thing. This was an experimental project that, you know, got launched in this kind of arcane email list on the internet. And so the early adopters were all people who almost definitionally had to be drawn to it through some personality quirk. And these tended to be, you know, unusual people who are very interested in their computers and in libertarian ideology.
Final question. Are you still on the case?
I'm not actively on the case, but I'm always interested in entertaining new theories, and I'm fascinated. You know, I'll be fascinated if someone else puts forward some new solutions.
Congratulations on the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you, Michael.
Benjamin Wallace is the author. The book is called The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto. I want to talk about not only Satoshi Nakamoto, but also just cryptocurrency generally. As I made reference with Benjamin Wallace, Peter Thiel, the PayPal founder turned venture capitalist, gives a talk. He's bullish, and he speaks of an enemies list for cryptocurrency. Quote, and so I want to maybe end with an enemies list, a list of people who I think are stopping Bitcoin. He wanted to expose them. He showed a slide of a hater he called enemy number one. It was Warren Buffett. I knew that Buffett was famous for his sensible investing strategy, writes my guest Benjamin Wallace, that he had a passion for contract bridge and that he'd pledged to give away his entire fortune. Apparently, though, Buffett had a dark side. Thiel called him the sociopathic grandpa from Omaha. Buffett's crime had been to call Bitcoin rat poison. Enemy number two, JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, who exemplified what Thiel called the New York banker bias. Dimon had made the mistake of dissing Bitcoin as worthless. Enemy number three was BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. His crime against Bitcoin wasn't immediately clear. Together, the men were what Thiel, who was 54, called the gerontocracy. Thiel contrasted these oldsters with a photo of a palmy Miami and this revolutionary youth movement. We have to go out from this conference and take over the world.